A very warm welcome to this webinar on how to support the greatest number of your pupils with action plans. And I'm really delighted to welcome two people who are very key, particularly in Steer, but across the board as well, in their respective schools. First of all, we have Lauren Goodwin, who is the Trust Designated Safeguarding Lead, Senior Leader and DSL at King John's School in Benfleet in Essex, and also their Strategic Lead for Steer. And secondly, Dot Moen, who is the Assistant Head, Senko, and also the Strategic Steer Lead at Bromham Church of England School in Bedfordshire. And the idea of this webinar really is to help schools who are using Steer or having a look at Steer, and it's a chance to share the excellent practice that's being used, particularly in these two schools, so that other schools can benefit from their practices, their experiences, and what works well for them. So we'll kick off, if we may, Lauren, with you at King John School. I wonder, first of all, you could just tell us just a little bit more just about King John's.
Yeah, of course. We are a large secondary school in Essex, a comprehensive secondary school with a sixth form. We are a fairly undiverse school in terms of our catchment, but we do actually have a lot of students who actually travel in from a distance because we're part selected students as well in terms of an entry test. So we're quite an interesting makeup of students. We found in terms of why we were interested in Steer was because mental health and well-being was, as it is in most schools, our biggest concern that was linked to safeguarding. So that's why we started to look at well-being tracking. It was recommended to us by colleagues in another trust, and having seen the impact rate that really was coming from other schools, we felt it was something that was important to us as part of our early intervention work.
And so if I could just very quickly explain to those who aren't so sure, when you start at Steer, you start with, we have a modular approach. So you start just with tracking. There are other modules which I'll move on to later on. So you just have tracking in your school, which enables you to track every pupil and also then to be able to put action plans and support in place for individual students. So can you just tell us roughly how many students you tracked across the school?
So we were doing it for all of our year 7s to 11, so it works out about 1,800 students, I think.
And that went well? And
yeah, it went really well. Yeah, we managed to launch it obviously with all year groups successfully. The software is really simple to get used to. The students don't have to fully understand everything that Steer is about. So as staff, I think we get a lot of information about the kind of rich data set that we'll get from it. Actually, students don't need to understand that at all. And actually, you know, one thing we'll move on to later, I'm sure, is whether your wider staff need to understand it. And the answer is no. As long as your strategic lead understands it and has invested in the why, actually the students simply log on and take a very innocuous survey with just questions around a safe space. They don't really understand what they're disclosing in that survey, but what we did then find was that rich data set that came from it. And as time progresses, we may well then look to have the modules for outside of school as well, having seen the benefits in school. But I think we're just trying to run before we, or trying to walk before we run.
Exactly, and I think what you've hit on there is that I think, yeah, our assessment is very different, isn't it, to the sort of traditional surveys, sort of looking forward rather than looking back, and using that imagination rather than the closed questions, and picking up those sort of hidden issues that might not be obvious. So in terms of after you had assessed all the pupils, what was the way, how did you approach then looking at that data and getting the staff to A, understand it, and then B, to write those action plans to support those pupils that needed it?
So we actually changed our approach halfway through, but I still would do it in the same order if I did it again. Originally, we made sure that our key pastoral staff took the training, which obviously works out to about an hour of training, which explains how STEER works, so that they, again, understood the why and that they understood the kind of data that they were going to see. We did that with, because we're obviously such a big school, we have to have such a big pastoral team. So we did it with our heads of year, student support officers. We also brought in our SENCOs. We brought in our pupil premium coordinator, which was actually, I would recommend that for schools as well, because that's really driven some of the action plans with some of our students, and obviously the DSLs. We took the training and then did the post-assessment tutorial with our STEER coordinator, Claire, and then from that she was able to help us to interpret the data that we had and demonstrate then how to do it. Everyone found that really simple, and I remember when we were looking to launch STEER, the big bit of feedback that Trevor and Claire and Leslie, who I worked with at STEER, gave me was that once you see your kids and that data, you will understand how this works. And it was really interesting because when the names came up, there were a couple of our key safeguarding students that we might deal with for suicidal ideation, self-harm, etc. But actually, the students that were starting to flag were names that you'd go, okay, do you know what? I did have an interesting conversation with them the other day. We did talk about escalating behaviour. We actually, yeah, he did say that he's struggling with this at the moment. I didn't think much of the conversation at the time, but that's really interesting that now he's shown as a, you know, what's known as a priority student in terms of perhaps really struggling to steer themselves. And so once you see it with your children in front of you, that really became live for us. So the staff in that first post-assessment tutorial were then focusing on just writing their first action plans, looking at how that worked, and thinking about kind of what intervention that child needs. But I think the key thing for anyone that obviously hasn't done it is that it's all prompted the whole way through. So you will go, actually, I think that applies to my student. I think this would be really achievable with my student. You don't have to come up with it, you know, so it doesn't matter if you work in mental health and well-being as a key role in your school, because actually all that STEER is suggesting is really most of the action plans are around a type of conversation that you will have with your child. So it might be having a conversation about getting more involved in school. It might be a conversation around, you know, here's who you can trust at school. Again, such low level things that anyone feels confident to have those conversations with the kids as long as you've got a relationship with them. I think that's when we slightly changed our approach, having realised that it was just a conversation. That's when we realised that to get through the numbers that we needed to in such a large school, that we needed to bring in the tutors because we couldn't get to all the students. So actually we had quite a bit of a delay between our post-assessment one and then writing the majority of our action plans. And that was really due to the key pastoral staff struggling to find time for it, which I think is what every school worries about when they bring in any new system into a school. So I think when we realised it was just a conversation, we realised that why weren't we involving the tutors in it? So I literally looked for the next pastoral meeting that we had on the calendar, which is normally run by our heads of year. So we then took that meeting and I did a 10-minute launch where I didn't go into exactly what everything meant. I didn't, you know, go fully into what polar self-disclosure meant, but just explained that they will be given a list of priority students who have been identified as needing a bit of support. And here's how you write an action plan. And by doing it that way, all we said to the staff is, here are your kids. You might have 3, you might have 1. Some tutors had none, but then learnt by kind of working with their colleagues. And they moved then into their year group teams and they literally clicked through the software and went, this person's a priority. Yes, this might be a problem for them. Yeah, actually, I do worry about this for them. I'll have this chat, the end. And within that first meeting, we did 170 action plans in about 40 minutes. And I think the big thing off the back of that then was that when we'd prioritised year 11, knowing that their exams are coming up and wanting to make best use of the software for them. So they were a bit, we dealt with that a bit quicker. They've now done assessment 2 as well. And the data shows that there was a 93% improvement in their tracking between 1 and 2, which obviously is great news for us because hopefully it means that all that intervention then was useful, but also that they are in the best possible place they could be going into their exams, and they are students that we wouldn't normally have considered. So I think my big bit of advice for anybody is don't be overwhelmed by lists, don't be overwhelmed by number. if you've got a whole school involved and buying into the fact that this is part of maybe your school improvement plan, or the fact that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, or all of those key lines that we know, if you can just get their buy-in and you can just get a meeting booked in your calendar, it can be done within an hour. And if a school our size can get it done in an hour, and then literally it's 5-minute conversations with a couple of key children in your tutor group, it's more than achievable. And I think once you actually break it down to that, it doesn't become this daunting mountain of how are we going to reach 170 kids. Actually, it's one tutor's got to meet with 1 or 2 children and have a chat. And that's what they should be doing anyway. That's something we're really big on here. Have a chat with your kids. So I hope that helps people in terms of how we've done it. And like I say, it isn't as daunting as first thought.
So it seems to me the key thing that you've talked about there was training key staff in terms of understanding the platform, helping them to be able to see who identify their priority students, and then how to put that support in place. And also, it seems, and you mentioned time, which of course is short for every member of staff, isn't it? So it was setting aside that time, wasn't it? That pastoral staff meeting. And how long was that meeting that you set aside?
It was just a normal hour-long meeting, which we do every week. They're either in departments or pastoral time. So we have that built into our calendar anyway. And we booked it in with an hour. I did a 10-minute launch for the whole staff in there and just said, you are going to have a conversation with some identified children. We will give you prompts about those conversations by using this software. And so that hour was spent with them just logging on. And that was actually probably the most difficult bit, actually, was everyone going, oh, I can't find my login in my email. That probably took the longest bit of time, actually, even though we'd asked staff to check beforehand. But we know, that's such a minor thing with just organisation of staff. But once you get over that, they all sat in a room really excited to see the kids that had come up and, thinking about the chats that they would have. And like I say, probably in terms of them settling in the room with their heads of year, and then I circulated along with a couple of the other DSLs who'd had the more in-depth training. We just circulated the room, and within 40 minutes, everyone had done their action plans. In fact, most had done it much quicker than that. And so within an hour meeting, all of the action plans were written.
And then you are able to see them, and everything's done. And just as a matter of interest, so between assessment 1 and assessment 2, how did you sort of keep those action plans alive so that they don't just sort of sit on a computer and someone says, well, I've done my action plans now, and I'll look at them in the next assessment? How do you sort of keep those at the front of people's minds between assessments?
Yeah, of course. So one of the things we've done is just kept staff up to date with the dates of our assessment 2 and when our next pastoral meeting is going to be, so that they kind of know when the deadline's looming, a bit like you do with any deadline in school. People work to deadlines. So we've informed them that they're doing their assessment round 2 here. And we've said the whole point is we want to be able to demonstrate that impact in their steering. So can you make sure you've had your chats? We recommend, and this was obviously, again, just from the feedback from the steer staff, you need a month to actually see if that comes to fruition, to have that chat, see if they do engage in the club, see if they do reach out to a trusted adult. So give it a bit of time to embed. So by kind of, again, explaining the process, but in a really simplistic way, we've been able to say to staff, get them done now, give it time to embed. We're going to do assessment 2 here and then look at whether they've shown an improvement here. And, there may well be staff who then haven't made that their priority, but hopefully when they see assessment 2, see the difference that it's made for a huge proportion of our cohort where there has been improvement. Those staff that then reflect and go, oh, there wasn't an improvement. And we are then, my understanding of steer is that, you're really going to focus on those kids who didn't improve the second time round. Actually, those staff, that's a bit of a reflection, isn't it? Like we do with all of our kids when they don't improve in a teaching and learning assessment. You reflect on your practice and say, was that enough? Did I get this right? Either because my action planning didn't really consider the whole child, or because I wasn't proactive enough with my action planning. Our tutors are asked to take a bit of responsibility for that, because actually all we're asking for is a bit of engagement with their tutees. And I think that is the basics of, good relationships. It's part of the teaching standards. So if your school have a focus on, tutoring as a role or however you choose to do it, I think it's more than reasonable to ask for them to do that. And I think it's what's more important than preventing things like escalations to suicide and mental health issues. I don't think there's anything more important than that.
And ultimately, of course, it saves you time in the long run, doesn't it? If you can help people all things happen, you're that proactivity, then you are, in the long run, you are actually saving yourself time. See, you said that there was a 90% success rate of those who were on an action plan. 90% of them improved after that second assessment.
Yeah, I think the initial data was 92. We went up to 93 by the time we'd had a few more go through when I last looked. But yeah, in terms of that cohort, that and that was particularly with our older students that we'd prioritised. That was a 93% improvement between 1 and 2, and that's because they were getting a bit of care and attention, and knowing someone's looking out for them at the most stressful time of their lives. You know, I think for a lot of students, they probably did feel then that they could trust others in this moment. You know, obviously we focused on the skill of low self-disclosure, which is that idea that they obviously don't feel that they can reach out to somebody. You know, by saying to them you can, and a tutor checking in on them and saying your well-being is still important, even not in those words, them feeling that they could go to somebody when they're feeling a bit stressed, I'm sure they really did feel like there was an improvement. So, you know, we might expect slightly lower numbers when we take our whole cohort into consideration as we do the rest of assessment too. But I do think it's a good indicator, isn't it, of, you know, students feeling seen and feeling heard and noticed. You know, especially in a big school like ours, you know, we used to do schemes like the invisible child, you know, the children that might be missed. Well, that you don't have to have a tutor that says, I think they're the invisible child. Steer demonstrates it for you based on their own voice. These children are telling you, I don't trust anybody. I don't trust myself. I don't trust anybody else. If they're telling you that, that's worth listening to.
And it's incredibly rewarding for staff to see that success and that encouragement, isn't it?
Yeah, sharing that data with them is important. You know, it is important that they know their work is having an impact, and knowing that this is not just it's not some fad that we've brought in just to tick a box for well-being. You know, I think especially because we were in a post-Ofsted world, you know, we went through a difficult Ofsted and then have had a really positive one since. I think it can be really hard for schools, you know, the wider teaching staff, to think when you do any kind of extra award or software that you might just be doing it to tick a box for Ofsted. There is no box for Ofsted that says you must invest in a software like this. But actually, if you are thinking about personal development of students, and if you have the belief that unless students are well regulated, they can't access your curriculum anyway, I think if you have that ethos in your school, there is nothing more important, and your staff will just buy into that. So I do think it's important to think about your strategic leads, because they are the one that becomes the voice of Steer. They have to be someone that the staff are going to respect and follow when you say, oh, I think this is really beneficial and this is why. And actually sharing that data, sharing a case study. We shared one case study, for example, of a student with additional needs when we did our first post-assessment tutorial, and we looked at our priority students as we were learning. Our SENCO took responsibility for one of the plans, and she was very much of the opinion, this is not going to make a difference. One conversation is not going to make a difference to this child who we've been working with on an EHCP plan for months. You know, not negative of the software, but just a bit like, yeah, I'll give it a go. With the LSA, they sat down and did one of the ideas was to have a conversation around trusted, like a circle of trust. Who would be in your circle of trust? And actually, we thought that was a really good one because it would be visual for a student with additional needs. And the LSA had the great idea of making it lily pads, because she loves frogs. So with that personal knowledge of the student, making it lily pads, who's on your lily pad? The student really engaged with the task. So she did talk about her trusted others, and actually, you know, we realised she really didn't have any, but we talked about who could be on her lily pad. Within 2 weeks, she had come to me as DSL and disclosed an issue online, quite a serious issue that we dealt with in safeguarding. She wouldn't have done that and had the bravery to do that had we not told her about trusted adults and explained to her who could be on her lily pad, who could be in her circle. And she is so much more regulated in school since then. And she's brighter in lessons. She is engaging more. You know, she used to walk around with her hood up all the time. You know, it's down, it's off. You know, being able to share that and staff going, yeah, I've seen that improvement. Being able to say, well, we think it's because of this intervention. I think being able to share that we'd tried it once, it been successful, here's a case study. Even that tiny case study of one student that staff could visualise, I think that helps. So I would say if I was going to do it again, I would still do that. Key pastoral staff, have a go at it, see if you can demonstrate it, and then launch it with your staff with confidence and positivity. That it is fantastic if you give it the time and attention.
Oh, thank you. I mean, those stories I think really bring it home, don't they? And moving on to you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about school to start with?
Yeah, in comparison to Lauren's huge job, although we're a very big primary school, we're just under 500. We actually started off just focusing, again, like Lauren, walk before we can run, especially with any new software. We started with year sixes, but to put the school in context, we have very low pupil premium, we have low EAL, we're in quite a well-to-do area, so we've you know, our children are very quite privileged in certain ways. And when we first started, we decided we'd do year sixes and a lot of it, year fives, and a lot of it was, oh, you know, they don't have any issues, do they? They're you know, quite privileged children and they get to experience lots of things. And our first year, I think Robert will agree with me, didn't go as I would wanted it to have done. So a bit like Lauren, we changed our approach, and this is actually our second year in doing it. So we have the data from our year fives, which are now our year sixes. And so we're now doing year 5 and 6s. It's a much more proactive year this year. And actually, because of that, we're seeing huge results.
And if I could just pop in a second, if I could just explain, Doctor, because you're in your second year, you have different modules,
yes,
and I can just sort of show you what those modules look like in terms of. Actually, I haven't got it available at the moment, but yeah. So you have.
Yeah, we do.
Sorry,
we have the PSHE one as well, and School Impact, which has been huge, been great for reporting back to governors. As Lauren already explained, it's really important as a SENCO, senior leadership, DSL, many hats, but with those many hats, I can bring that all to the SLT meetings and with phase leaders, etc.
So you can, you can just see here the different options that you have in terms of the plans that you can do, in terms of, so you can do a group plan, selecting a group of students, or a cohort plan where you're giving whole messages to whole, whether it's model targeted messages to a whole cohort or group of students, which I think and that's the sort of area that particularly you've picked up on, isn't it? Those group and cohort plans. Yes,
so very much so. After our second assessment, actually, our data was very good coming into our first assessment, and then in our second assessment, especially for our year sixes, we panicked. It didn't go well, and we were, oh, what are we doing wrong? But actually, with Robert's help, because we had a meeting, we looked very closely at the data and we realized it actually was in line with both home. It basically got the data and just moved it. And they're coming up to their exams. They're more heightened, they're more worried. Who do I talk to? Who can I talk to? So that's where our cohort plans have really come into play.
How did you sort of how do you set time aside to be able to write those cohort plans? Who was involved in that?
Well, actually, I'm very lucky. Our teachers are very much on board with STEER. They've seen the impact STEER can have. And this year, all of the teachers who are involved, we're slightly luckier in that we have one teacher per class. Lauren's got multiple teachers seeing multiple students. So that's where our difference is. For our primary school, we're able to actually involve those teachers very closely with looking at the data, having those conversations, looking at the action plans, and we created them together. And in creating them together, it gave them much more ownership of the action plan that's moving forward. So say, for instance, the whole cohort plan, it could be something as simple as, this is going to be our phrase for this term, and they've written it on the top of their boards. So it's visual all the time. And the children are able to tell me what their class target is. They don't realize it's come from STEER. But I would say, oh, what's this here? And, oh, that's our class target. That's what we're working towards.
So it's that constant messaging, isn't it? And that drip
Constant message, those conversations that are having. And as a whole cohort, it's nice to be able to do as a whole plan. We're all moving forward with this. We're going to growth mindset. We're going to change it. And there's so much support in this software to actually help you choose what to actually use as for your whole cohort plan. And it needs to be something that can be easily monitored, easily done, because if you choose anything that's too wild and wonderful, it's bound to fall off the edge. And I think with this, the teachers were able to see, they didn't have to sit down, as Lauren said, and pre-think of something, come up with something wild and wonderful. Lots of ideas are already there in place for it.
So in terms of the sort of cohort plans, that when you're looking at a whole year group or indeed a whole school, how do you sort of push those ideas? Is it in PHSE? Is it in form time? So it's
across the board. So it'll be in PSHE, it'll be in form time. We actually use the PSHE module that you showed there. I actually tend to use that more for group work, but I have pulled resources, or the teachers have pulled resources from it to back up their PSHE plans, to make them a little bit more relevant, more real to what they're doing.
Sorry, go on.
No, so yes, so that's basically, but what within our meeting when we were making the plans, the phase leaders are in there as well. So actually they talk about it during their pupil progress meetings, they talk about it in their phase meeting times. So it is up there in their priorities. They know about it and they need to talk about it. And often, as Lauren said, it could be a 5-minute conversation.
Yeah. And in your group plans where you have similar students who might be showing the same sort of issues, and I believe you sort of, as a group, you've pulled them out as a group, and then someone has put a group plan in place for those students and then selected goals and a signpost almost to use as a scheme of work for a group session. Is that right?
Absolutely. It being our first time, if you like, going through some of the group plans as the SENCO, I decided, okay, I'm going to take those group of girls in year 6 and I'm going to work with them. And I want to see how this is going to develop and play out, so I can talk very clearly, very succinctly to the other SLT members. This is what happened. This is my program. This is where we were with it. They actually called themselves Steer Girls. They named themselves Steer Girls. We met weekly. It was in their timetable. It was put very clearly in their timetable. The girls came down themselves and we worked through the PSHE program. Perfect. Which they really enjoyed.
So, and again, the key for you was to carve out some perhaps existing meeting time in order to create those plans?
We did. We had to, because our staff meetings, our times are so busy, but because I do have that buy-in, we actually had arranged ahead of time. Here's our assessment point. We're going to meet as a team on this date. So it was very clear, lots of time given. And you were there as well, Robert, very kindly. And we were sat and we discussed the data together. We looked at it. What I love about it is when I sit back and I'm watching the staff and they're sitting there going, told you. There we go. And it's like validation for what we would see. Well, I'm worried about them, but I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah.
And it gives you that validation. Your worries were correct. You were on the right lines. Here's how we're going to support.
Yeah, and I think that's right, isn't it? And the strategies for staff, so they don't have to sort of think of things themselves. Here are strategies to help you in what you thought might be the case, but as you say, it sort of validates them exactly.
Yeah, and they would often come to me because I'm the mental health first aider, so they would come to me around stuff around the mental health. But actually, it gives them the power, if you like. Here it is. We're demystifying it, and here's the strategies you can do to help with that.
Now, we've come to the end of our half hour, so thank you both very much indeed. But before we depart, I wonder very quickly if there was one piece of advice, Lauren, and you've given lots of advice, you both have, which is brilliant. But if there was one thing you would say about organising and the action plans themselves, what advice would you give people? Sorry to put you on the spot first.
No. I think mine would be to just have a go at writing them with your team, however big you've identified that to be, because once you do it, it isn't as daunting as you think. So just have a go rather than think, I have this many to get through. Just do what you can with the staff that you have involved.
Perfect, thank you. And Dot, what piece of advice would you give?
One of my bugbears, as you know, Robert, is doing something but it having no impact. My piece of advice would be you are writing an action plan, make sure that it is something that is achievable. The reviewing of the action plans is so simple, so quick, and you get your data with an immediate effect. So my advice would be absolutely go give it a go, see how simple it is, and keep it simple so that you know it's going to have impact. And that's the most important thing. There's no point just doing something if it's not going to have an impact. And it does have an impact.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think, the messages that are coming across loud and clear on the directed time after an assessment for staff to be able to see the data and have time to be able to write those plans. Interestingly, in a survey we had, I think it was nearly sort of 67% of people who responded say they wanted to write more plans, but they weren't given the time. So if, as you both have highlighted so well this morning, if you give staff time to be able to put these plans in place, you will see that impact. And as you both said, to make sure those meetings are planned well in advance. And the impact, as you both said, can be enormous. So thank you both very much indeed for taking time out of what I know are both incredibly busy timetables and schedules to share your experiences and ideas. It's been incredibly helpful. So thank you very much indeed. And I hope you all and all those listening have a great day.